All right, great. So I'm Matt Hauer. I'm an applied demographer with the Vinson Institute, and I'm probably one of the only applied demographers that you'll ever meet. We're kind of a rare breed. And I know that a topic such as demographics early in the morning can be kind of dry. Demography is not exactly a riveting topic. And so The Onion had actually published an expanded Inferno, and they included right down at the bottom demographers, a special layer in hell for us. But I'll try and hopefully we'll move higher up the Inferno instead of lower. So I want to start with a simple quiz to know what you guys know about the state that we live in. And so it'll be really simple, right? Our questions are up there, multiple choice. And I just want to hear you guys shout out what you think the answer is. How does that sound? Great. So what percent of the state's population is born in Georgia? What percent are native Georgians? 2. 3. 55.5%, right around. Now, the population, when we talk about this, includes those under the age of 18. So if we exclude them, it's right around 49%. So just over half of Georgia's population are native Georgians. How many people in Georgia speak a foreign language in their home? 1, 2, 4, 3. We're all over the place today. Well, it's more than 1 million. More than 1 million people in Georgia speak a foreign language in their home. That's amazing when you think about it. Now, when we talk about the population of Georgia and how it's changed over the last 100-plus years, it's pretty clear that the growth that Georgia has been experiencing has been really a recent phenomenon. When we go back to 1900, for most of the 20th century, Georgia saw very little population growth. And it's really not until the 1970s onward that we really start to see the explosive growth that has characterized Georgia in the last 40 years. And so demographers, we have a way of characterizing this change, how this population has changed. We call them components of change. And we have what's called net migration and natural increase. And so net migration is the number of people who move in minus the number of people who move out, and natural increase is the number of births minus the number of deaths. And so as we can see, right up until right around 1970, more people left the state of Georgia than moved in. Georgia was a net exporter of people. And right around 1970, we have a sliver of positive net migration. And each decade after that, we see more and more and more net migration. This all tops out in the 1990s, where just over 1 million more people moved into the state than left. That's a tremendous number. So to illustrate how rapid this growth has been, the Census Bureau publishes a list of the 100 fastest growing counties in America. There's over 3,000 counties, and so we're talking about the cream of the crop, the fastest of the fastest. And Georgia, on that 100 the fastest growing list, Georgia has 4 of the top 20, 10 of the top 50, and 18 of the top 100 fastest growing counties in America. So over 10% of all of our counties in the state are on the 100 fastest growing county list. And we're not talking about small counties either. These counties in 2000 accounted for 1.6 million people in the state, and 10 years later, they're 2.4 million. So where are these counties at? Gwinnett, Cobb. Well, the top 4 are all ex-urban counties. When we look at the top 10, we still see that ex-urban growth around Atlanta. When we look at the top 18, we still see more growth northerly, and we have a couple of other counties throughout the state. Now, not every county has had this sort of rapid growth. When we look at all population change for all counties, and the gray are counties that lost population over the last decade, we can clearly see that southwest Georgia and east Georgia are losing population. The coast and north Georgia are growing very rapidly. I do like to take a real quick detour and talk about Atlanta specifically, because I think oftentimes whenever I talk about the state, it tends to be characterized as Atlanta and everyone else, and then the city of Atlanta and everyone else outside of the city of Atlanta. So what we're looking at right here is housing density in metro Atlanta. This is the 10-county regional commission. This is housing density in 1940. And we can look and see how Atlanta has changed since 1940. And that dense urban core that we think of Atlanta and the rest of the region, is no longer that dense urban core. We really talk about Atlanta, we really see a region. We really see that Atlanta isn't the city of and everyone else. It really is a massive region. I can watch this thing go for like forever. So our view of Georgia is here, but reality is very different today. Now, I think historically, Georgia has been primarily a black and white state. In 1980, 98% of all Georgians were either black or white. Our Hispanic population was right around 1% of our population, and all other race groups combined made up less than 1% of the population. So really, the state was a black and white state. 30 years later, though, we see a very different picture. Our state's no longer black and white. What was 98% is now 86%. Our Hispanic population, that was right around 1%, is now approaching 10%. And all other race groups combined, we can now start to break them out and talk about them individually. And if I were to make a bold projection and a prediction, it would be that Georgia becomes minority-majority sometime around 2025. So the whole state's identity is changing very rapidly. And we can see this in the census count since 1980, where white and black have been growing, but a disproportionate amount of that growth has been occurring with our Hispanic and our other group. Now, where do we think most of the state's Asian population lives? Gwinnett? Anywhere else? Just Gwinnett? Cobb? When we look at where most Asians in the state are located, it's pretty clear it's metro Atlanta. And I do have a saying that tends to make people kind of uncomfortable, especially elected officials, and that's that Georgia is the new California. But I think there's a really good reason as to why. We have traditional immigrant gateways, places like New York City, Seattle, Los Angeles. And we have emerging new immigrant gateways, non-traditional gateways. And Georgia has 4 counties that have been identified as emerging new immigrant Asian destinations. And they're Henry County, Gwinnett, Fulton, and Cobb. And we can see the change in the Asian population in these 4 counties has been incredible. Henry County is one of only 4 counties it's one of the top 4 fastest growing counties for our new Asian immigrant population. And Gwinnett has the largest numerical new immigrant Asian population in the country. So when we talk about New York City, in Seattle, in Chicago. We have to talk about Atlanta too. We have to talk about these emerging gateways. Where do we think most of the state's Hispanic population lives? I guess we can go ahead and get Gwinnett and Cobb out of the way now. Hall? Dalton? Fulton? We see Metro Atlanta, but we also see a lot of other counties throughout the state. Counties we don't think about, right? I love seeing Colquitt County on the same map as Gwinnett. Glynn County on the same map as Gwinnett. But when we look at the percent of the county population that is Hispanic, we see a very different map. One in which we have a Hispanic population that's throughout the entire state. In some areas that are very heavily Hispanic that we don't think of. And what's most interesting to me as a demographer about this map is the line that goes right through the middle of the state that separates the different industries that Latinos in Georgia work in. It's amazing how it's so visual. You can see it right away. Now, when we talk about our Hispanic growth, these are the 20 counties in the metro area ranked from most rapidly growing on the left to slowest growing on the right. So we have Forsyth and we have DeKalb on the far end. And what's plotted is the change in the Hispanic population over the last decade. And so the more rapidly a county was growing, the more rapid the Hispanic population was growing. And as a county is slower growth, it's slower Hispanic growth. And this makes a whole lot of sense because a rising tide is going to lift all boats, right? But if we flip it and we instead of looking at growth of the Hispanic population, but the percentage of the growth that is due to our Hispanic population, we see the opposite trend. Again, still ranked the exact same way from Forsyth to DeKalb, but now the percentage of that growth is captured by our Hispanic population. And so we can see the slower growing a county is, the larger share of their population change that is due to Hispanic population growth. With Hall County being a major anomaly. So here's the 18 fastest again to show it's not just in the metro area. And these are population change for our Hispanic population over the last decade. 4 counties lost Hispanic population, 3 counties. Yeah, 4. But it's pretty much the same. The most rapidly growing counties in the state have the most rapidly growing Hispanic populations. Now, numerically looking at these 4 race groups and how they've changed in our state, we see that black grew the most rapidly, followed by Hispanic, and then white, and then other. But we can look at the percentage change within that race group, and we see something that is very different. And we can think about this another way, and that's an annualized growth rate, like a bank account. And some of those growth rates are things I wish I had on my bank account. And we can think about it in one last way, and that's how long it will take a population to double at those rates. So we have extremely rapid growth and healthy growth mixed with very slow growth. And this is one of the things that's driving the change in the racial composition of the state. And so we can see how this kind of plays out geographically for the entire state. Again, counties in gray are counties that lost population. And so we can see, again, South Georgia, Southeast Georgia, and East Georgia losing white population. We can look at black population, we see something that's very similar, but if we look at our Hispanic population, we see something that's very different. Those areas that were losing total population, total white, total black, are increasing in their Hispanic population. So the racial composition in a lot of areas in the state, it's changing very rapidly. Now I do want to shift to another component of change, and that's fertility. And for a demographer, when we talk about fertility, we only care about one thing, and that's the number of women of childbearing ages. And we define, men don't even come into the equation. And we define childbearing ages as menarche to menopause, 15 to right around 50. And so the state population in 2000, when we're talking about these prime childbearing ages, these are bracketed off in black. And so we can see that a large chunk of the state's population is inside of these age groups. And so as a demographer, we have tons of metrics. And the total fertility rate is the one for fertility. It's the number of children a woman will have in her lifetime. And so statewide in 2000, the total fertility rate was just over 2.1. And when we break it down by our race groups, we see white was just below, black was just above, other was far below, and Hispanic was far above. The average Hispanic woman in 2000 had 3.5 kids. Now this is old data, right? This is 12 years ago. We can look at how these have changed over the last decade, and we see that in the post-dot-com era, we have a trend for slightly lower fertility. Do you want to guess what the recession has done to fertility rates? It's collapsed it. Now, I don't include Hispanic fertility in here because Hispanic fertility in 2000 was 3.5, and in 2009 it was 3.5 as well. That the same fertility decline that we see for white and black in the state, we don't see for our Hispanic population. So what does that mean then, right? What do these fertility rates mean for our population? What does it mean going forward? So I've bracketed off another age group, what I call prime school age population. It's 5 to 25, so that way we'll get kindergartners all the way up through grad students. And this is what the age distribution was in 2000. And with some projections out to 2020, we see a rise, an increase in this population. In 2010, just to show that we are already seeing that rise. We're already seeing this increase. And to show how we sort of rank with our peers, all of our neighboring states, this is the percentage change in our population under the age of 18, our minors. And Georgia has a very rapid rate compared to all of our neighbors, North Carolina being the only one that's just above. Now, as that young population, as it continues to age through, it's increasingly going to become non-white. And so I get asked a lot, well, what about immigration reform? How is that going to impact our Hispanic population? Is it going to keep growing as rapidly? Well, the Pew Hispanic Center had a report, I believe it was just over 2 years ago, just under, where they found that for the first time ever, births had overtaken immigration as the component of population change. That for the first time ever, births attributed more for the Hispanic population change in America than migration. And just a year after they published this, they found that net migration from Mexico had reached 0. That the same number of people who came to America were leaving as well. I think educational attainment is pretty important whenever we talk about our population. And I sort of want to talk about how confusing graduation rates are and how thankful I am that we're moving to a new system. So in 2006, and I'll explain why it's 2006, the state reported our graduation rate, our high school graduation rate, at 72%. The U.S. Department of Education calculated it at 62%, and Education Week, an independent nonprofit, calculated it at 56%. Which one is the right one? Well, I like going with Education Week since they use a cohort model, the one that's very similar to what we'll be moving to. And so the national graduation rate in 2006 was 69%. So Georgia was far below the national graduation rate. And the reason why it's 2006 is because it takes 4 years to graduate. And so what this means is that in 2009, 64,000 students in Georgia did not graduate high school that should have. And barring any radical change in our graduation rate, we can assume that in 2010, close to 64,000 students did not graduate high school that should have, and again in 2011, and so on. And we all know that educational attainment is so heavily correlated to so many socioeconomic outcomes. We can talk about poverty rates, and we can see that the higher in education you are, the probability of you being in poverty decreases. We can look at earnings, and it's the same thing. With the higher your education, generally the higher your earnings are. We can look at unemployment rate. We can see the exact same thing, that the higher your education is, the lower your unemployment rate tends to be. And when we look at the effects of the recession, we see that those who experienced the largest increase in their unemployment were those with less than high school diploma, and those that saw the least impact from the recession are those with a bachelor's degree or higher. And so this leads me to this map of the United States and where Georgia ranks. So our 18 to 24-year-olds who don't have a high school or diploma or equivalent and are not enrolled in any type of schooling, Georgia has the third highest rate in the country of our 18 to 24-year-olds without a high school diploma or equivalent and are not enrolled in any type of schooling. It's right around 15%. 15% of our 18 to 24-year-olds are recent graduates. And we talk about an unemployment rate of 10% as being high. Do you want to guess what this population reports? How many report having a job? Just 50%. No education, no schooling, and no job. Now, when we look within race group within the state, white, black, and Hispanic, we see white and black have comparable educational attainment rates compared to our Hispanic population, where over 45% of Latinos in the state have less than a high school diploma. Now, this is heavily influenced by international migrants, people who were not schooled in America. But still, the numbers are pretty stark. So it's no wonder, right? We can educate or incarcerate. Now, I gave a talk at the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank with Dowell Myers. He's a professor of planning at the University of Southern California. And he had some really great slides, and so I took them from Dowell. So he's got nice credit down here. But he looked at how immigrant status, how it changes the longer you're in America. We often hear, when you look at a lot of these numbers, well, I guess we should all learn Spanish. But Dowell found that might not be the case. So we can look at BA completion. And so these are people who came to America in 1985 to 1989, all international migrants. And so we see that over time, bachelor's completion doesn't change. Neither does a profession that you are. What does change over time is the percentage of people who attain citizenship. Home ownership rates, incomes go up. It's hard to assume that somebody who comes to America at the age of 25 with a wife and kids is expected to also support a family and go to school. But Dowell looked at English proficiency too. And so he's found that English proficiency among the same migrants by age, that it doesn't really change for 20 plus. If you were over the age of 20 when you came to America, or if you were 10 to 19. But if you were just a child, your English proficiency skyrocketed. And so to show how it sort of changes with home ownership, these lines correspond to the immigrant waves. And so we can see that over time, in 1970, that wave, their home ownership rate approaches what is the population average, even if home ownership rates for the immigrant population as a whole remain stagnant. And in some cases, it even exceeds the population. So when we talk about then Spanish users among our Latino population, those who are Spanish dominant, bilingual, and English dominant, when we look to the second generation, we see Spanish dominance is minimal, and it's practically disappeared within the third generation. And so he showed some projections showing these same categories and how the change in English proficiency within our Latino population in the country is going to largely be driven by demography. The second and third generation Latinos won't be speaking Spanish, they'll be speaking English. Now, I do want to talk about aging, right? That's another thing that we hear a lot about, and our aging population. Medicaid and Medicare was just alluded to at the start. So these are the percentage change in a couple different age groups in Georgia for the last 20 years. And I'm not sure if I was looking at these numbers that I would conclude that Georgia is experiencing an aging problem. I mean, our most rapidly growing age group are right, people right in the middle. We still have rapid growth underneath, right? So I want to go through a population projection. Some of you have seen my presentation before, so I'm sure you have done now a population projection. But I imagine nobody in here has done a population projection. I think that's a safe assumption. So we're going to do one right now. We're going to do a mock population projection. So a 25-year-old in 1990, 20 years later, so in 2010, a 25-year-old becomes a 45-year-old. Right. 25-year-old becomes 20 years older. So in terms of a chart, a 25-year-old moves over and down. They move diagonally through the graph. This is where we get the 110%, 111% change in our 45 to 64-year-old population. So then that same 45-year-old in 20 years becomes a 65-year-old. So again, they move over and down. And that growth that we saw before is going to be minimal in the next 20 years. But this change is going to be much larger than it was the previous 20. And this is the aging of the baby boom. This is the baby boom working its way through the population. And so we can see it with our age structure. Here it is in 1990. I have the boomers highlighted. I mean, it is a massive wave of population. When we look at 2000, it's like a wave that's beginning to crest. We can go to 2010, and we can still see that population moving through. 2020 as well. Now, the way to read this is you read an age group vertically. So in 1990 and 2000 to 2010, and then massive increase. Whereas over the next 20 years, we see very little growth in our population, our working age population. I do want to touch on health real quick too, briefly. Georgia has a very high rate of our percentage of our population that's uninsured. It's one of the highest in the country, just over 42% of our population that is within the threshold of poverty are unemployed or uninsured. And so you can get these things called county health rankings, where they rank the health of a county. And so when we kind of look at just the counties as a whole, it's kind of hard to discern any real patterns. And you can kind of see metro Atlanta, and you can kind of see southwest Georgia, but it's kind of muddled. So I broke this down into regions, what the National Center for Health Statistics calls health service areas. And now we can see a much clearer picture of terms of health outcomes for the state. The darker the color, the worse the ranking. And so all through southwest Georgia and middle Georgia, we see health outcomes that are very low. And we can break this out further, right? What are the components? What is driving these health outcomes? We can look at mortality, death rates, and we see that, well, it's not really mortality so much in here, but in southeast Georgia, it's definitely mortality. We can look at morbidity. Well, now southeast Georgia doesn't have necessarily the same morbidity problem or healthiness problem as southwest Georgia. Socioeconomic as well. Another outcome, another contributor to health outcomes. And lastly, access to care, or how easy it is to receive care, get access to it. And southeast Georgia is massively plagued by that. Whereas southwest Georgia has a decent access to care, it just suffers socioeconomically. So some real quick conclusions. The most rapid growth in the state is occurring with our youngest and our oldest populations, but the populations in the Middle Ages, not the time period, the age groups, are growing the slowest. And that Georgia really is no longer a black and white state. It is rapidly diversifying, very rapidly, and will continue to. How do you plan for this change? I want to leave with two quotes. I hear this quote quite often, demography is destiny, and I've been told it's probably because I'm a demographer. But I think that there's a lot of truth to it. We talk about the baby boom. And boomers have lived lives, had children, raised families, gone to school. So, in essence, demography is destiny. But I really like this Abraham Lincoln quote, where he said the best way to predict the future is to make it. The best way to predict the future is to make it. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We're to the point in our agenda where we have a brief break. We have a 20-minute break at this point. And so this is a chance to go check on your emails, to get a refresh in your coffee, and we'll come back here in 20 minutes and continue with our next speaker. Thank you very much.